Green and good. Oh. Yes, it works. Before we turn the stream on, Frank, would you lead us in a quick prayer? And then we'll begin. Hmm. Hmm. As Gabby Hayes might say. Maybe I should do that, grow my beard back and get a beat up old hat. And, you darn cheating. Yeah. I could be the comic relief in any kind of church service. Yeah. Darren, how you doing? It's good to see everybody today. Good to go? Okay. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. It's good to have everybody here. And I hope that whether you're here live in person or joining us on stream, I hope you survived the big freeze. And if you're not back to normal, you're getting there. You're 90% done or something like that. Just before we started the stream, we had a prayer for our class and for everybody watching, and we pass on those prayers and petitions and blessings to everyone who may be watching right now. Just a reminder that this is a series that we're teaching on lessons in leadership, as seen through the stories that we find in Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther. If you're counting lessons, this is lesson number 6, and we're in the story of Nehemiah. And if you will turn in your Bible or your tablet or phone or other device to Nehemiah chapter 4, that's where we'll be opening up our story. And just kind of get a setting here. We are in a period of the history of the Israelites where a remnant, as God has predicted and prophesied and told his people, a remnant has returned from Babylon, and they have returned to reestablish and repopulate the nation of Judah and the city of Jerusalem. And they have been in the process of that for several decades now. And the situation at hand is that although a remnant has returned and they've had some modified success, they have rebuilt the temple, they have not rebuilt the walls, the city walls. And that's a big deal, because back in the day, in that day and time, primary defense for a city were the walls that surrounded it. If you didn't have the walls, you were vulnerable to attack. And besides which, it just created all sorts of problems for social media. Just think of all the snarky comments that came up on your Yelp page. Gee, don't spend any time in this city. The walls are just terrible. But you can kind of get an idea that a city without walls was not much of a city. And with that in mind, I want to begin our discussion today by, as we go into chapter 4, by looking at one of the minor characters, both in terms of the overall story and in personality, and that's a guy named Sanballat. And he is the governor of one of the governors in a region that we call Trans-Euphrates. That's the region north of the province of Judah. And I spent a few minutes thinking about trying to get inside this character's head, because he kind of strikes me as your typical politician. He probably came up in the ranks. He is used to a political system and a situation where whatever member of the ruling party he's with, they've had it pretty good for several decades. It's probably a one-party system. They're used to having things their way. After all, it's been that way pretty much for decades now. And one of the best parts of all is that they are the big dogs in town or in the region, literally, because up to this time, Judah and its capital, Jerusalem, have been pretty much in poor condition. This is a region that for decades now, once the most powerful nation in the region, if not the world, it's been lying in shambles. And it's a nation that has been feared, detested, despised because of its power, because of its influence, because of the favor that God bestowed upon it. And now that seems to be over with. And life is good if you're a guy named Sanballat, because you can be your typical run-of-the-mill politician doing pretty much everything you please. Until one day, this stranger shows up in the office. And he's not any kind of stranger because, number one, he's got this letter. And this letter has the seal of the king, the emperor of the Persian Empire. So that right away tells you, something's up. Not only that, but he's not by himself. He's accompanied by this cavalry of the king's horsemen and the king's soldiers. He's got an army behind him. This is one really powerful dude. Not only that, the letter that he's handing you says, I'm the new governor of the city of Jerusalem and of the region of Judah, and I've come here to do some things that the king wants me to do, has authorized me to do. I want you, in fact, if you'll read the letter here, the king has authorized me to ask you to support me in whatever way you can to carry out these tasks. Well, you can just imagine what's going through Sanballat's head. What the heck is going on? Suddenly, this region to the south, this region that you've been poking fun at, despising, and kind of celebrating the fact that they are nowhere near what they used to be, something's about to happen. And could this mean that the good times are over? Something is definitely about to change. And that may explain why back in chapter 2, Nehemiah records that Sanballat and Tobiah, the other governor in the region, when they get news about what's about to happen, they have a very strong response. You know, we've talked about, if you've gone through any kind of training or counseling in your work, you probably have heard of and dealt with the 5 stages of grief. You know, there's absolute denial, then suddenly there's these intervening stages of acceptance and dealing with it. Well, what we've seen here, one of the underlying stories in the book of Nehemiah, are the 5 stages of dealing with Nehemiah as far as Sanballat is concerned. Stage 1 was being greatly disturbed. What is going on? What are we going to do? And he soon gets his political senses kicked back in, and he says, I know what we can do. We can ridicule this thing before it, and stop it before it begins. And at the end of chapter 2, we see that, where Sanballat and his allies put on this campaign of mockery and ridicule. Basically, they say, what are you doing? And added with a touch of implying that a little bit of treason's going on. oh, you know why they're doing this? They're going to build up Jerusalem. And when they do that, they're going to revolt against the king. Well, that doesn't stop him, because Nehemiah basically says, he does his reconnaissance of the walls. It's as bad or worse than he was led to believe. And he pulls the city leaders together and says, we got to do something about this or we're in trouble. And so they begin rebuilding the walls, and they actually start having some success. It's a unified, coordinated effort, as we see in the rest of chapter 3. And then, of course, when you're having success in your work, especially when you're having success in doing God's work, there's going to be pushback. And that continues as we open into chapter 4. And Nehemiah records that when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. This is stage 3. Anger, furiousness, just rolling over in the floor with you're so angry and upset about what's going on. So what's his response? He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates in the army of Samaria, he said, and he asked these 5 little questions. In fact, you can almost kind of visualize this. If you watch cable news or watch local political news, they have what they call a morning presser. Basically, it's a press conference, and it's called late morning, and that's time to get the TV crews there. And the folks who call the press conference get up and they say provocative things. They may even do provocative things, all to the good of getting it on tape, and for the reporters to get their stories together, come back and put a package together, and there they are at the late afternoon, the evening news. So and so said this, and they just made this amazing charges against the opposition. Well, this is kind of what's going on. Sanballat and his crew asked these provocative questions. What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from these heaps of rubble, burned as they are? In other words, the unanswered or the unasked questions here. What's being implied is, do they really expect God to help them? Do they have any idea what they're doing? No. They're expecting the impossible. Yes. And Tobiah the Ammonite, who is at his side, grabs the podium long enough to say, what they're building, even a fox climbing up on it would break down their walls of stones. Maybe he brought a sponge cake from home and demonstrated walking up on the sponge cake with his fingers, and it collapses and everything like that. That's what's going to happen. They're going to make fools, utter complete fools of themselves, trying to rebuild this wall. It'll collapse right on top of them. Well, it's not their wall. It's God's wall. God has something to say about it. And Nehemiah thinks about that. In fact, in his account, he stops, he pauses, and he utters this prayer. Verse 4, hear us, our God, for we are despised. And he asks for 3 things. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Number 2, give them over as plunder in the land of captivity. Number 3, do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults. They have provoked you to anger, Lord, in the face of the builders. So Nehemiah does what we should always do when we face opposition. We take it to the Lord in prayer. Let God deal with it. Ask for God's help and guidance, and you'll figure out how and the best way to respond to that kind of opposition. So, verse 6, Nehemiah continues, we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, where the people worked with all their heart. God basically inspires the city residents to continue the work, despite this very well-planned attack of ridicule and scorn. It doesn't work. The wall is, before anybody realizes it, it's already half built. Well, that should settle it, right? That should shut the opposition up. No, the resistance grows. We now see stage 4 in Sanballat's plan to oppose Nehemiah and oppose the rebuilding of the wall. Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, the people of Ashdod, because no good politician is without some kind of a coalition to carry out what he wants to carry out. When all these people heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead, the gaps are being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. They've gone past just ridicule and scorn. They are now dropping hints of armed resistance, maybe even terrorism. Because, and in response to that, verse 9, Nehemiah says, we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Nehemiah continues to pray, but in seeking God's guidance, he sees where there are some appropriate steps to take to carry out the Lord's work. You may recall a few weeks back we had the series John Reese was teaching on balancing faith and works. You know, faith is important. It's really important. That's what saves us. That's what that enables us to carry forward. But there are certain points in time where action on our part is not only appropriate but necessary. And that's what we see here. Nehemiah not only prays, he starts posting guards, just in case these are credible threats of opposition. Meanwhile, and here's another thing, even though the work is halfway done, that doesn't mean the problems go away. The problems continue. Meanwhile, the people of the tribe of Judah, basically the most powerful and the most important part of Jerusalem society, come to Nehemiah and say, the strength of the laborers is giving out. There is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. Keep in mind, they're trying to repair a situation that has been in place now for more than 100 years, maybe a century and a half. Dating back to the time when the Babylonians came in and conquered the city. They broke down the walls. And that rubble that they're talking about are from the original walls that were broken down and never repaired. And the rubble is in a way, before they can even, in some places where they can continue to build or even begin building, they got to deal with this rock and stone and all the stuff that's grown up around it in order to do their job. Verse 11, also our enemies said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to the work. So while they're trying to clear the deck to do the work, they've got these rumors of attack, of terrorism. Don't look now, but the guy who's behind you may be there just to put a sword in your back, or to clobber you with a stone, to knock you out, to kill you. Do you really want to be working in a situation like this? Not only that, the rumors were rampant. Verse 12, the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over. And that's not necessarily a literal term. That's just a Hebrew way of saying numerous times, too many times to count. Wherever you turn, they will attack us. Now keep in mind, sometimes you don't need a literal military force to carry out an attack of terrorism. Basically, all you need to do in some cases is just the threat of it. All the little threats of, well, you never know. Gee, if you walk into that building, it might blow up and come down and on top of you. That kind of thing. Destabilize the population, demoralize them by building fear into them. Well, again, Nehemiah responds where a response is appropriate. Verse 13. Therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. One of the most familiar lines in the Bible. Don't be afraid. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. And this, Nehemiah's actions and the people's response have an appropriate effect. Verse 15, when our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated it, we all returned to the wall, each to our work. So the plans, what this rumors of an attack, real or unreal, however it may be, come to nothing. They're frustrated. From that day on, in verse 16, half my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other. Was that cumbersome at times? I'm sure it was. But basically the bottom line was the workers were prepared for anything. Each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked, but the man who sounded the trumpet of alarm, that if an actual attack occurred, the guy with the shofar, the ram's horn, would blow on it. That would be the signal to, hey, you need to get over here and assemble and deal with this crisis. That guy stayed with Nehemiah, so he could be dispatched as quickly as possible. Verse 19, then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. Our God will fight for us. So we continued to work with half the men holding spears from the first light of dawn till the stars came out. At that time, I also said to the people, have every man and his helpers stay inside Jerusalem at night, so they can serve us as guards by night and as workers by day. Neither I, nor my brothers, nor my men, nor the guards with me took off our clothes. That is, they did not undress for bed or sleep. They kept their clothes on, all the better that if there is a surprise attack, and if you were going to have a surprise attack, what better time than to do it when they're in the middle of the night, when everybody's asleep. If that were to occur, they didn't want to waste precious time getting dressed, so they slept with their clothes on. Each had his weapon, even when he went for water. So the idea here, be prepared at all times. Don't be caught by surprise, if a surprise attack occurs. Kind of reminds you what Paul talks about over in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 10, where he tells us to put on the whole armor of God. Of course, Paul's allegory here is spiritual, not physical, but the whole idea is to be prepared spiritually and mentally for what lies ahead in turn when you carry out God's work. Chapter 5. Again, the problems continue. Kind of you remember the old Morton Salt slogan, when it rains, it pours. Well, it's raining and it's pouring. Because we read in chapter 5 that the men and their wives, basically the residents of Jerusalem, raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, we and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain. Others were saying, we're mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine. Still others were saying, we have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we're powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. What's going on here? Well, troubles are multiplying, but these troubles are not coming from the outside. They're not coming from Sanballat and his crew of merry minions. These troubles are coming from are internal. They're coming from the inside. you have a whole section of folks inside Jerusalem who you think would have known better, who, for whatever reason, are not with the program. Lots of problems here. First of all, the people who are rebuilding the wall, they're working from crack of dawn to late at night. They don't have time for regular work. And this is, of course, this is during a period where most folks were not on salary. If you didn't work at a particular job, you didn't get paid. If you didn't get paid, you didn't eat, because unless you grew your own food, you had to buy it. If you didn't have the money, you couldn't buy the food. So you have little or no household income due to rebuilding the wall. Not only that, if you'll notice, in verse 3, they make reference to a famine. What happens when it doesn't rain, and what happens to the crops? Basically, they collapse on you. You don't have anywhere near the amount of food crops that you otherwise would when it stops raining. And what else happens? What happens to the food that remains or is there? The prices for it go up. You know, that 99-cent loaf of bread all of a sudden costs what? $3.99. Things get awfully expensive. And of course, you don't have the money to buy the food in the first place. And then there's a third problem: taxes. Whatever else is going on, the local government wants their share of the money. And the bottom line is, with all these pressures on the people to keep a roof over their heads, to buy food to eat, pay their taxes, what are they doing? They're borrowing money. What are the nice local businessmen doing? Oh yeah, we'll give you the money and we'll charge you interest for it. Well, they may be calling it interest. The Old Testament, the law of Moses, calls it usury, something that they were not supposed to do to one another. And charging at a rate to the point where they were having to, in some cases, sell their children into slavery. That was the only way to pay their debts and get out. So you've got this horrible situation going on where people can't eat, can't afford the food that they are eating, and they're literally selling themselves into slavery to their fellow Jews in order to survive and exist, all to get the walls rebuilt. Well, Nehemiah records that in verse 6, when I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind. Good for Nehemiah, because the worst thing you can do when you get angry over something is to say or do something immediately when you're angry, because you may wind up saying and doing a totally wrong thing. Nehemiah doesn't go off half-cocked. He sits down, he ponders the situation, he thinks about it, and then in verse 7, he then accused the noble officials, the people in charge, the people who were basically creating this situation. I told them, you are charging your own people interest, or more precisely, usury. So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, as far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you're selling your own people only for them to be sold back to us. In other words, guys, don't you see the irony here? We spent the past several decades in slavery to other people, to the Gentiles. We've now gotten out of that slave situation, only to return here, and now we're selling each other into slavery. Don't you see the irony in that? Well, apparently they do. The business leaders kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So I continued, what are you doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain. But let us stop charging interest. Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves, and houses, also the interest you're charging them, 1% of the money, grain, new wine, and olive oil. Well, Nehemiah's appeal has an appropriate effect. We will give it back, they said, and we won't demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. Well, that's good. Nehemiah asked one more thing. I summoned the priests and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they'd promised. In other words, it's good that you're willing to do this, but I want to make sure that you're committed to doing it and not just talking about it. Verse 13, I also shook the folds of my robe and said, in this way may God shake out of their house and possessions anyone who does not keep this promise. So may such a person be shaken out and emptied. At this, the whole assembly said amen and praised the Lord, and the people did as they had promised. Good for them. They did the right thing after Nehemiah told them to do it. But more than that, Nehemiah did more than just tell them what to do. He practiced it. In verse 14, he writes that from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, until his 32nd year, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor. But the earlier governors, those preceding me, placed a heavy burden. They taxed the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition to food and wine. Their assistants also lorded it over the people. But out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. Instead, I devoted myself to the work on the wall. All my men were assembled there for the work. We did not acquire any land. Furthermore, 150 Jews and officials ate at my table, as well as those who came to us from the surrounding nations. Each day 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some poultry were prepared for me, and every 10 days an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. In spite of this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor, because the demands were heavy on these people. In other words, Nehemiah, as governor, was entitled to basically all expenses paid in wining and dining, not only feeding himself and his family and his friends, but also whoever he invites as his guest. The people paid for that through taxes, and taxes probably was, we'll take that chicken you got over there, or that wonderful looking steer, and thank you very much. Nehemiah didn't do that. Nehemiah hosted a pretty good table, but he did it out of his own expense, out of his own pockets. He didn't go to the people and take it from them, either through money or through livestock or whatever. He paid it on his own dime. Not only that, he also donated much of his food to the other residents of Jerusalem, because he knew the people were hurting. Kind of reminds us of what Paul reminded the Corinthians about, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where he said, when I was your minister, when I was working among you, I could have insisted on a salary. I could have insisted on some kind of support coming from you guys. I didn't ask for it. I paid my own way. This is pretty much what Nehemiah did. The idea was, I'm here, I'm a servant of the people. I'm here to serve them, I'm here to help them. I'm not here to lord it over them, and I'm not going to do that. And Nehemiah closes chapter 5 by saying, remember me with favor, my God, for all I have done for these people. Well, as we get into chapter 6, the wall is almost completed. Because in verse 1, Nehemiah says, I had rebuilt the wall, and not a gap was left in it, though up to that time I hadn't set the doors and the gates. The work's almost done. Sanballat's campaign has pretty much failed, but Sanballat has one more stage to go through in opposing Nehemiah. Verse 2, Sanballat and Geshem the Arab. Basically, Geshem, we don't know much about who he is. He's a political ally. I kind of like to think of him as what we call a useful idiot. Sometimes you need those when you're running these kind of campaigns. Anyway, Sanballat and Geshem sent me this message. Come, let us meet together in one of the villages on the plain of Ono. Oh no, they want us to come visit. And what's going on here? Well, this is the final stage, which is one of distraction. He's almost done. If we can find some way, any way, to get him off course, because this guy is focused like a laser beam on what he wants to do. If we can get him distracted in some way. So the first kind of distraction is, hey, you've been working too hard, Nehemiah. Take a break. Get away. Let's relax and rusticate on the plains of Ono. You know, that's just such a wonderful resort area. We can go water ski even if there isn't any water. They got a lovely tapas bar, you know, and maybe even a Taco Bell. We can just kind of hang out and have a good time. But Nehemiah sees through the plot. He says, they were scheming to harm me. No, you know, despite how appealing they were trying to make it sound, he had a pretty good idea that once he got out of Jerusalem and into the plains of Ono, something bad was going to happen. So I sent messengers to them with this reply. I'm carrying on a great project and cannot go down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and go down to you? 4 times they sent me the same message. Those guys, if nothing else, are persistent. And 4 times, Nehemiah gives them the same answer. Sorry, can't make it. My date book is booked up. Then the 5th time, verse 5, Sanballat sent his aide to me with the same message, and something new has been added. In his hand was an unsealed letter in which was written, "It is reported among the nations, and Geshem the Arab says it is true." Gee, I didn't know Geshem carried that much weight. But it's been reported that you and the Jews are plotting to revolt, and therefore you are building the wall. Moreover, according to these reports, you are about to become their king, and have even appointed prophets to make this proclamation about you in Jerusalem. There is a king in Judah. Now this report will get back to the king. So come, let us meet together. Oh, Nehemiah, you're in trouble. All this rumors going around that the only reason you're doing this, rebuilding the walls and restoring Jerusalem, is that you're gonna revolt against the king. What will the king do if this kind of word gets back to him? Hey, let's get together, bud. I've only got your best interest at heart. I sent him this reply. Nothing like what you are saying is happening. You're just making it up out of your head. You're a liar, Sanballat. Liar, liar, pants on fire. Go look at that PolitiFact column in the Jerusalem Morning News. You'll find out that there's nothing like that I've ever said. In fact, Nehemiah just really doesn't get into the details. Sometimes when we're confronted with an accusation like that, oh well, I'm gonna break this down detail by detail. I'll tell them why they're wrong. Nehemiah doesn't even get to that. Basically, his response is, I'm not even going to dignify this accusation by responding to it. You're just out of your head, Sanballat. Quit wasting my time. Verse 9, they were all trying to frighten us, thinking their hands will get too weak for the work and it will not be completed. But I prayed, now strengthen my hands. Now comes episode 2, maybe episode 3 on the distraction phase. One day I went to the house of Shemaiah, son of Delaiah, the son of Mehethavel, who was shut in at his home. He said, let us meet in the house of God, inside the temple, and let us close the temple doors, because men are coming to kill you. By night they are coming to kill you. They're coming for you, Nehemiah. Oh my, there's no way to escape. All you can do is run to the temple, go inside. You'll be safe there. You'll also be committing a big fat sin, because who gets to go inside the temple? Only the priests, only the Levites. Nehemiah may be a lot of things. He's not a priest. He's not a Levite. And verse 11, I said, should a man like me run away? Or should someone like me go into the temple to save his life? I will not go. I realized that God had not sent him, but that he had prophesied against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. If he were a real prophet of God, if he was really doing God's work, the last thing he would have said, in fact, he would never have said it at all, was, "Hey, Nehemiah, come inside the temple," because he knew that was breaking the law of Moses. He had been hired, this prophet had been hired to intimidate me, so I would commit a sin by doing this, by going into the temple. And then they would give me a bad name to discredit me. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, my God, because of what they've done. Remember also the prophet Noadiah and how she and the rest of the prophets have been trying to intimidate me. So, distraction doesn't work. Intimidation doesn't work. Nehemiah keeps focused on the job that he's been given to do. And as a result, verse 15, the wall was completed on the 25th of Elul in 52 days. In the space of less than 2 months, Nehemiah has completed the job he was sent to do. When all our enemies heard about this, all the surrounding nations were afraid and lost their self-confidence because they realized this work had been done with the help of our God. There is one last thing that Sanballat does, even though he was a total jerk and a total failure in trying to stop Nehemiah. In those days, the nobles of Judah were sending many letters to Tobiah, and replies from Tobiah kept coming to them. For many in Judah were under oath to him, since he was son-in-law to Shechaniah son of Era, and his son Jehohanan had married the daughter of Meshullam, son of Berechiah. Basically, the enemies of Nehemiah are well connected, even though they're not part of Jerusalem. They're well connected by having married into the families in Jerusalem. So they start pulling those strings. Hey, Nehemiah. Or, hey, son-in-law. Hey, daughter-in-law. Hey, fifth cousin on my wife's side. Go to Nehemiah and tell him what good people we really are. Yeah, I know we behaved badly, but we're not such bad guys because, after all, we're related to you. Moreover, they kept reporting to me Tobiah's good deeds and telling him what I said, and Tobiah sent letters to intimidate me. Because, after all, I'm one of you. I am part of you, and I'm still a pretty rich, powerful, and good-looking dude. But Nehemiah sees it for what it is. Well, and back in World War II, there was a name for people like this who were sending this kind of propaganda to Nehemiah and to other people. They were called the fifth column. People who intentionally or unwittingly were helping carry out the enemy's plans by spreading their propaganda. Doesn't work. The job is done. Nehemiah's work is completed, and when we get into chapter 7 next week, we'll see the further actions that he carries out in reestablishing Jerusalem as a city. Before we go, I think there are a few questions I'd like to leave with you about the leadership lessons or the examples that we saw here in Nehemiah's actions. They all revolve around the concept of perseverance, especially during crisis situations. Problems and crises seem to pile up in when it rains, it pours kind of manner. If there's going to be one problem, there's going to be a whole dozen of them, it seems like. And then, as we saw today, these problems can arise externally and internally, as they did for Nehemiah. It's critical during these times to persevere in doing God's work. And I want you to consider these questions. Externally, Nehemiah had to deal with his enemies to derail the rebuilding of the walls through campaigns of ridicule and terrorism. Think of your response to difficulties or opposition from someone. It could have been a co-worker or an agency or a company when you had to complete an important task. What helped you stay the course in completing your assignment? What lessons from Nehemiah can you apply in dealing with such opposition down the road? And then, of course, there were internal issues as well. Internally, Nehemiah had to deal with businessmen who were exploiting the crisis by bankrupting and enslaving workers who were helping rebuild the walls. Sometimes we find ourselves having to deal with others who are unaware of a critical situation, or even though they are on our team, they're just not team players. What are the best ways to deal with such individuals, keeping in mind that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't necessarily work for all people or all situations? And then the third question has to do with setting personal examples. Practice what you preach does matter. In chapter 5, Nehemiah listed examples of how he carried out from the very beginning the very things he commanded his fellow Israelites to do. Can you think of leaders in your personal experience who helped or harmed their influence by the examples they set in their lives? And how did these examples shape your opinion of those leaders and how you should lead? Some recommendations for additional reading. If you haven't already, read chapters 4 through 6 in the book of Nehemiah. Some of the scriptures on perseverance: 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 through 10, 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 15 through 16, Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, James chapter 5, verses 10 and 11, and then Revelation chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. Hope you jot those down and take a moment and study those verses as well. Well, coming up next week, our old friend Ezra the scribe, Ezra the teacher, reappears to lead the Israelites in public study and prayer. And we'll cover that in the next section of chapters in Nehemiah, chapters 7 through 9. If you will, read those chapters, and that will be the focus of our lesson next Sunday. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Have a great week, and we'll see you next Sunday. Yes.